Clara adjusted the lace curtains in the parlor of Belmont Manor, her eyes catching a faint tremor in Mrs. Lennox's hand as she reached for her teacup. The matriarch, usually vibrant and commanding, looked pale and frail, her once bright eyes clouded with exhaustion. Something wasn't right, Clara thought, but she couldn't yet put her finger on it. The morning air felt heavier than usual, thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to the mansion's ornate walls. Clara, diligent and methodical in her work, had spent years quietly observing the rhythms of the Lennox household. She knew its members' routines, their moods, even their secrets, or so she had believed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp voice of Thomas Lennox, the eldest son. "Clara, bring the files from my study to the library. Now." "Yes, sir," Clara replied, bowing her head slightly to mask her irritation. Thomas's arrogance had grown more pronounced in recent weeks, his temper flaring unpredictably. She often found him pacing the halls late at night, his face etched with a mix of frustration and ambition. Whatever troubled him, it wasn't something he was willing to share. As Clara walked briskly to the study, she passed Adrian's room. The younger Lennox son had distanced himself from the family, spending most of his days in solitude. She glanced at his closed door, her mind briefly lingering on the way he had looked at Mrs. Lennox during breakfast, concerned but helpless. Inside the study, Clara's hands brushed against a set of papers scattered across the desk. As she gathered them, a faint metallic scent caught her attention. Her eyes narrowed. Tucked beneath the stack was a small vial, its contents a murky, pale green. Clara hesitated, her pulse quickening. Why would Thomas have such a thing? Footsteps echoed in the hallway, jolting Clara from her thoughts. She quickly slipped the vial into her apron pocket and hurried toward the library. Thomas was waiting, his expression sharp and impatient. "Took you long enough," he muttered, snatching the files from her hands without a glance. Clara forced a polite nod and retreated to the kitchen. Alone at last, she retrieved the vial and examined it under the warm glow of the overhead light. Her instincts screamed that this was no ordinary medicine. The faint scent, the peculiar color, it all felt wrong. That evening, Clara lingered in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she brewed a pot of tea. Her mind raced with questions. Was Mrs. Lennox's sudden decline a natural progression of her age, or was something more sinister at play? Clara couldn't shake the image of Thomas's cold expression or the strange vial in her pocket. As the household settled into its evening routine, Clara resolved to uncover the truth. She would need to tread carefully. The Lennox family was powerful, and she was merely a servant. But deep down, Clara knew that something dark was festering in Belmont Manor, and she was determined to find it. The halls of Belmont Manor were unusually quiet, the sort of stillness that heightened Clara's every sense. As she polished the silver candlesticks in the dining room, faint voices drifted from the study. She paused, her cloth stilling against the polished surface. The voices belonged to Thomas and Adrian. She stepped closer to the door, heart pounding. Eavesdropping was a risk, but something in their tone, the sharpness of Thomas's voice and the tension in Adrian's reply, made her linger. "You're pathetic, Adrian," Thomas sneered. "Always hiding away, pretending you care about Mother. If you cared, you'd stay and help instead of running off like a coward." "I'm not the one exploiting her illness," Adrian shot back, his voice shaking but defiant. "Whatever you're doing, Thomas, it won't end well." Clara's breath caught. "Exploiting?" The word echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She pressed her ear closer to the door, straining to hear more. "You don't know what you're talking about," Thomas replied, his voice cold and clipped. "Stay out of my way. This house and everything in it will be mine, whether you like it or not." Adrian's reply was too muffled to make out, but the sound of shuffling feet sent Clara darting back to the dining room. She resumed polishing, her hands shaking as Adrian stormed past the door, his face pale and tight with frustration. He didn't notice her as he disappeared down the hall. Thomas followed moments later, his expression smug. He stopped when he saw Clara, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you just standing there? Haven't you got work to do?" "Of course, Mr. Lennox," Clara replied evenly, keeping her gaze fixed on the candlestick. Thomas lingered for a moment longer, his gaze heavy, before leaving. Clara exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing slightly. Something was terribly wrong in the Lennox household. Adrian's words replayed in her mind, fueling her suspicions. Later that night, Clara moved quietly through the darkened halls of the manor. She stopped outside Mrs. Lennox's bedroom, listening to the faint sound of her labored breathing. Peering inside, she saw the frail woman propped against a mountain of pillows, her hands trembling as she reached for the glass of water on her nightstand. Clara hesitated before entering the room. "Mrs. Lennox, would you like me to help?" The older woman turned her head slowly, her eyes glassy but warm. "Clara, my dear, you're too kind. I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble at all," Clara replied, gently handing her the glass. As Mrs. Lennox sipped, Clara noticed the deep shadows under her eyes, the brittle texture of her once lustrous hair. She felt a pang of anger. This was not the slow decay of old age, this was deliberate. "Has Mr. Thomas been bringing you your medicine?" Clara asked, her tone as casual as she could muster. Mrs. Lennox smiled faintly. "Yes, he's been very attentive. Too attentive, perhaps. But it's sweet of him to care." Clara's stomach churned. "I'm glad to hear that, ma'am. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to call for me." As she left the room, Clara's resolve hardened. Thomas was up to something, Adrian's words, the strange vial, Mrs. Lennox's condition. The pieces were beginning to align. Clara knew she couldn't confront Thomas directly. She was a servant, after all, with no power or authority in the household. But she wasn't entirely without resources. In her small room on the upper floor, she retrieved an old camera she had kept tucked away for personal use. It was time to gather proof. As she set the device on her narrow desk, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. If she was caught, the consequences could be dire. But the image of Mrs. Lennox's frail hand trembling as she reached for her glass quelled her fear. Clara whispered to herself, "I'll protect her, no matter what it takes." The early morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Belmont Manor as Clara carefully positioned the camera in the corner of Mrs. Lennox's bedroom. The angle was discreet, capturing the nightstand and the table where Thomas often prepared her tea. With steady hands, Clara ensured the device was hidden behind a decorative vase, its lens aimed at the precise spot where she believed the truth would unfold. The house was still waking. Clara could hear the faint clinking of dishes in the kitchen and the low murmur of Thomas's voice somewhere down the hall. She hurried back to her duties, feigning the same unobtrusive demeanor that had allowed her to move through the household unnoticed for years. That evening, Clara retrieved the camera under the guise of changing the flowers in the vase. Her heart pounded as she carried it to her room, the door closing softly behind her. She set the camera on her desk and rewound the footage, her fingers trembling as she clicked play. The grainy black and white image of Mrs. Lennox's room appeared on the small screen. Clara fast-forwarded through the hours until she saw Thomas enter the frame. He moved with practiced ease, placing a tray of tea and biscuits on the nightstand. Then he paused, glancing toward the door before pulling a small vial from his pocket. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching as she watched him tilt the vial, pouring its contents into the teacup. He stirred the liquid with deliberate precision, his expression calm, almost clinical. When he was done, he placed the vial back into his pocket and left the room without a backward glance. She sat back in her chair, a mixture of horror and vindication coursing through her. There it was, the proof she needed. Thomas was poisoning Mrs. Lennox, but for what purpose? Was it greed, a bid for inheritance, or something more sinister? As Clara processed the implications, a knock at her door startled her. She hastily turned off the camera and tucked it into a drawer before opening the door to find Adrian standing there, his face clouded with concern. "Clara, can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as if to ensure they weren't being watched. "Of course, Mr. Adrian," Clara replied, stepping aside to let him in. He closed the door behind him, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I need to ask you something. Have you noticed anything unusual about Mother's condition? I mean, anything that doesn't make sense?" Clara hesitated. Adrian's sincerity was evident, but she knew the risks of revealing too much. "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't trust Thomas," Adrian admitted, his voice low. "He's been acting strange and I can't shake the feeling that he's hiding something." Clara studied him for a moment, weighing her options. "Mr. Adrian, I believe your instincts are correct. There is something wrong. I've seen things I can't ignore." Adrian's eyes widened. "What kind of things?" Clara glanced at the closed door, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't explain everything right now, but I have proof that your brother is involved in something dangerous. Mrs. Lennox's health isn't declining naturally." Adrian's expression darkened, a mixture of anger and disbelief. "If you're right, we need to act. Do you have evidence?" "I do," Clara replied, her resolve firm. "But we have to be careful. If Thomas finds out what we know, he won't hesitate to silence us." Adrian nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll help you. Whatever it takes, we'll protect my mother and stop him." As Adrian left her room, Clara felt a spark of hope amid the fear. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her fight. With Adrian's support, she could take the next step in her plan, but she also knew that Thomas wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, Clara hid the incriminating footage in a safe place, determined to protect it at all costs. Tomorrow she and Adrian would decide their next move. But for now, as the shadows of Belmont Manor stretched long and dark, Clara prepared herself for the battle ahead. Clara sat across from Adrian in the dimly lit library of Belmont Manor. The flickering glow of a single lamp illuminated their tense expressions. Spread out before them on the mahogany table were still frames Clara had printed from the hidden camera footage. The grainy images showed Thomas pouring a mysterious liquid into Mrs. Lennox's tea. "This is it," Adrian said, his voice barely a whisper. He tapped a finger on one of the photos. "This proves he's poisoning her. But why?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "But I suspect it's about the inheritance. If something happens to Mrs. Lennox, I assume the estate would go to him?" Adrian nodded grimly. "Yes, as the eldest son he would inherit everything. And with my decision to step back from the family business, there's no one to challenge him." He hesitated before adding, "But there has to be more to it. Thomas is cruel, yes, but this is monstrous." Clara met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "Whatever his reason, we need to stop him. I can't stand by and let him harm her any longer." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "We'll need help. Someone who can take this evidence and act on it, someone Thomas can't intimidate or buy off." "I was thinking the same thing," Clara said. "Perhaps Mrs. Lennox's doctor? He's close enough to the family to care but far enough removed to stay objective." Adrian nodded slowly. "Dr. Harris. He's been with our family for years. If anyone will take this seriously, it's him." The plan was set, but as Clara returned to her room that evening, a heavy sense of unease settled over her. Thomas was observant and ruthless. If he suspected she was working against him, the consequences could be dire. The following morning, Clara delivered Mrs. Lennox's breakfast with her usual care, noting the faint color returning to the matriarch's cheeks. Clara had discreetly replaced the tampered tea with a fresh brew, ensuring her health wouldn't worsen further. As she adjusted the pillows behind Mrs. Lennox's back, the older woman gave her a grateful smile. "You're so kind, Clara," Mrs. Lennox murmured, her voice weak but sincere. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Clara smiled warmly, though her heart ached at the thought of what had been done to this gentle woman. "I'm always here for you, ma'am." As Clara left the room, she nearly collided with Thomas in the hallway. He was impeccably dressed as always, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that made Clara's skin prickle. "You seem to be spending a lot of time with my mother," Thomas said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Anything I should know about?" Clara forced a polite smile. "Just taking care of her, sir. It's my job." Thomas studied her for a moment longer, then smirked. "Of course. You're such a loyal little worker." With that, he strode past her, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Clara watched him go, her pulse racing. He knows something, she thought. Or at least he suspects. She quickened her pace, heading toward the kitchen to meet Adrian. That afternoon, Adrian and Clara met with Dr. Harris in his office. The doctor, a wiry man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, listened intently as Adrian explained the situation. When Clara placed the photos and a USB drive containing the footage on his desk, Dr. Harris's expression darkened. "This is alarming," he said, adjusting his glasses as he examined the evidence. "I had my suspicions about Mrs. Lennox's condition, but I never imagined." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You did the right thing bringing this to me. What can we do?" Adrian asked, his voice taut with urgency. Dr. Harris sighed. "First, I'll need to run some tests on Mrs. Lennox to confirm the presence of toxins. If the results match what we suspect, we'll have grounds to involve the authorities." "And Thomas?" Clara asked, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "What if he finds out what we're doing?" Dr. Harris hesitated. "We need to proceed carefully. If he feels cornered, he might become even more dangerous." Clara and Adrian exchanged a glance, the weight of the doctor's warning settling heavily on their shoulders. They were walking a fine line, and one misstep could have devastating consequences. That evening, as Clara returned to Belmont Manor, she felt the oppressive atmosphere of the house more acutely than ever. Thomas's presence loomed like a shadow, his watchful gaze following her every move. She knew the risk she was taking, but as she glanced at Mrs. Lennox's closed door, she reminded herself why she was fighting. In her room, Clara sat by the window, gazing out at the sprawling gardens bathed in moonlight. The battle had only just begun, but she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in Belmont Manor had shifted, the tension growing thick enough to choke. Clara moved through her daily routines with an air of calm, though her every nerve was on edge. Thomas's watchful eyes followed her more closely now, his questions more probing, his presence more ominous. At breakfast, Thomas sat at the head of the table, sipping his coffee leisurely while Mrs. Lennox picked at her food, her frailty more pronounced than ever. Adrian remained silent, his eyes flicking nervously between his mother and his brother. "Mother," Thomas said suddenly, breaking the silence, "you've been looking better these past few days. Clara must be doing an excellent job taking care of you." Mrs. Lennox smiled faintly. "She's a gem. I don't know what I'd do without her." Thomas's gaze slid to Clara, who busied herself clearing away the dishes. "Yes, quite the indispensable worker. Don't you agree, Adrian?" Adrian stiffened, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. "Clara's been loyal to this family for years. I trust her." "Trust," Thomas said, his tone dripping with mockery. "A precious commodity these days." He stood, adjusting his cuffs. "I'll be in my study if anyone needs me." As he left the room, Clara risked a glance at Adrian. His jaw was set, his expression a mix of anger and unease. Clara understood the unspoken message. Thomas was onto them. Later that afternoon, Clara walked into the library to find Thomas standing by the window, a drink in hand. He turned as she entered, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. "Clara," he said, his tone deceptively warm. "I've been meaning to thank you for your dedication to my mother. You're quite the asset." Clara forced a polite smile. "It's my duty, sir." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Is that all it is? Duty?" Clara's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Mr. Thomas. What else would it be?" Thomas studied her, his gaze sharp and probing. "I've always admired loyalty. It's a rare trait these days." He paused, his expression hardening. "But disloyalty? That's something I can't abide." Clara swallowed hard. "I understand, sir." "Good," Thomas said, setting his drink down. "Because in this house, everyone has their place. And I expect you to stay in yours." Clara nodded, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. As Thomas walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers, she felt the weight of his unspoken threat. He knew. Maybe not the extent of her plan, but enough to make her a target. That evening, Clara met Adrian in the secluded greenhouse at the edge of the estate. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the tension that crackled between them. "He's on to us," Adrian said, pacing back and forth. "We need to move faster." "Dr. Harris is running the tests," Clara replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "Once we have the results, we can go to the authorities." Adrian stopped, his face pale in the moonlight. "And if Thomas finds out before then? He won't just sit back and let this happen, Clara. He'll do whatever it takes to protect himself." "I know," Clara said softly. "But we don't have a choice. We can't rush this and risk losing everything." Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're braver than I am. If it weren't for you, I don't know if I'd have the courage to face him." Clara smiled faintly. "We're in this together, Mr. Adrian. For your mother." Adrian nodded, his resolve hardening. "For her." As Clara returned to the manor, the oppressive silence of the house pressed down on her. She moved cautiously through the halls, her footsteps barely making a sound. Reaching her room, she locked the door behind her and retrieved the hidden camera from its place in the wardrobe. She reviewed the day's footage, her heart sinking as she watched Thomas pacing in Mrs. Lennox's room, his agitation evident. He muttered to himself, his movements sharp and erratic. Then, in a chilling moment, he turned toward the camera, his eyes narrowing as if he sensed he was being watched. Clara's breath caught. He hadn't found the device, not yet, but it was only a matter of time. She knew she needed to act quickly. The walls were closing in and every second counted. The next day, Clara delivered the footage to Dr. Harris, her hands trembling as she handed him the USB drive. "This might be the last piece of evidence we need," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Dr. Harris nodded, his expression grave. "I'll analyze this immediately. Stay vigilant, Clara. Thomas is dangerous, and he won't hesitate to strike if he feels threatened." Clara returned to Belmont Manor, the weight of the doctor's words heavy on her mind. As she entered the kitchen, she found herself face to face with Thomas. His smile was razor-sharp, his eyes glinting with suspicion. "Busy day?" he asked, his tone light but his gaze unrelenting. "Just the usual, sir," Clara replied, keeping her voice neutral. Thomas leaned closer, his smile widening. Good. I'd hate to think you were keeping secrets from me. Clara forced a smile, her heart pounding as she watched him leave the room. The web was tightening and she was caught in its center. But Clara wasn't done fighting, not yet. The morning air in Belmont Manor carried a peculiar weight, as if the walls themselves knew of the darkness that loomed within. Clara stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she didn't dare drink. Her eyes darted to the clock. It was almost time. Mrs. Lennox's bedroom was eerily quiet when Clara entered, the hidden camera freshly repositioned to capture every angle of the nightstand. The matriarch lay propped against the pillows, her breathing shallow but steady. Clara adjusted the blankets with care, her movements deliberate as she ensured everything was in place. "Clara, you've been a godsend," Mrs. Lennox murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're too kind, ma'am," Clara replied softly. "Rest now. I'll be back shortly." As Clara left the room, she lingered just outside the door, her heart racing. Moments later, Thomas appeared, his footsteps measured and precise. She stepped into the shadows, her breath caught in her throat, and watched as he entered his mother's room. The footage from the camera played on Clara's laptop that evening, each frame confirming her worst fears. Thomas had entered the room with a tray, his movements calm and practiced. He prepared his mother's tea with meticulous care, pausing only to reach into his pocket and retrieve the vial. Clara's hands clenched into fists as she watched him pour the liquid into the cup, stirring it slowly before placing the cup back on the tray. His face remained neutral, betraying none of the malice behind his actions. He lingered for a moment, brushing a hand across Mrs. Lennox's hair in what might have seemed a tender gesture, then left the room. Adrian sat beside Clara, his jaw tight as he stared at the screen. "This is it," he said, his voice barely concealing his rage. "This is what we need to stop him." "We can't act yet," Clara said firmly, though the anger in her voice mirrored his. "Dr. Harris needs time to confirm the poisoning. If we go to the authorities now, Thomas could twist everything against us." Adrian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Every second we wait, he's putting her life at risk." "I've been switching her tea with fresh cups," Clara reassured him. "She hasn't been drinking what he prepares." Adrian's eyes softened. "You've thought of everything." Clara turned her gaze back to the screen. "We need to stay one step ahead of him. For her." That night, Clara returned to her room, her nerves frayed but her resolve intact. She carefully copied the footage onto a second USB drive and hid it in a hollowed-out book on her shelf. If Thomas discovered her room, he wouldn't find the evidence easily. As the house fell silent, Clara found herself unable to sleep. The memory of Thomas's cold, calculated movements haunted her. She was no stranger to hardship, but the malice she had uncovered in Belmont Manor was unlike anything she had ever faced. A sudden knock at her door startled her. Clara's heart raced as she approached the door, opening it cautiously to find Adrian standing there, his face pale and drawn. "He knows," Adrian whispered, his voice trembling. "Thomas knows we're working against him." Clara felt the floor shift beneath her. "How?" "I overheard him on the phone," Adrian said. "He didn't mention your name, but he's suspicious. He's already taken steps to cover his tracks." Clara's mind raced. If Thomas was aware of their actions, it was only a matter of time before he made his move. "We need to stay calm," she said, forcing herself to sound confident. "Dr. Harris is running the tests and we have the footage. We're close to bringing him down." Adrian hesitated, his fear evident. "Clara, if he finds out about you?" Clara placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "I've come too far to stop now. We're going to finish this." The next morning, the tension in Belmont Manor was palpable. Clara moved through her chores with practiced precision, her senses attuned to every sound and movement. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, but his absence only deepened her unease. As she entered Mrs. Lennox's room, Clara was relieved to find the older woman resting peacefully. She replaced the poisoned tea with a fresh cup, her hands steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Clara," Mrs. Lennox said softly, her eyes fluttering open. "Is something wrong?" Clara hesitated, then smiled gently. "Nothing you need to worry about, ma'am. Just rest." Mrs. Lennox's gaze lingered on Clara, a faint smile curving her lips. "You've always been like family to me, you know." The words struck Clara deeply, strengthening her resolve. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know." As Clara left the room, she nearly collided with Thomas in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his tone light but his gaze sharp. "You seem awfully busy these days." "Just taking care of Mrs. Lennox," Clara replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Keep up the good work." As he walked away, Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The poison was in the cup, but the fight was far from over. The tension in Belmont Manor reached a breaking point as Clara continued her quiet war against Thomas. Every step she took felt weighted with the awareness that her time was running out. The evidence was mounting, but Thomas's suspicion had turned into outright hostility. That morning, Clara found herself summoned to the drawing room. Thomas was seated in his usual commanding position, an untouched glass of scotch at his elbow. He gestured for Clara to sit, his smile cold and calculating. "You've been very attentive to my mother lately," he began, his tone casual but undercut with menace. "It's my job, Mr. Thomas," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, but I can't help but notice how often you've been in her room. Almost as if you're hiding something." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding. "I've only been doing what's necessary to ensure her comfort." Thomas chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "Comfort? That's admirable." He straightened, his expression hardening. "But let me make something very clear. My mother's well-being is my responsibility, not yours." "Yes, sir," Clara replied, masking her fear with a calm facade. Thomas rose abruptly, towering over her. "Stay in your place, Clara. People who overstep often find themselves regretting it." Clara held his gaze, refusing to show weakness. "Understood, sir." As she left the room, Clara felt her legs tremble beneath her. Thomas's threat was unmistakable. She needed to act quickly before he escalated further. That evening, Clara met Adrian in the stables, their usual meeting spots in the house no longer safe. The dim lantern light cast shadows across Adrian's face, his expression taut with worry. "He cornered you, didn't he?" Adrian asked, his voice low. Clara nodded. "He knows I've been in Mrs. Lennox's room often. He's watching me more closely now." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Dr. Harris says he's close to confirming the toxins in her blood work. Once we have that, we can involve the authorities." "It might not be fast enough," Clara said, her voice firm. "He's already suspicious. If he feels cornered, he could become even more dangerous." Adrian clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I won't let him hurt you, Clara." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "This isn't about me. It's about your mother. We need to stay focused." Adrian nodded reluctantly, his resolve hardening. "I'll speak with Dr. Harris tomorrow. We need to expedite this." The next day, Clara returned to her room to find it ransacked. Her belongings were strewn across the floor, drawers pulled from their slots, and the hollowed-out book where she had hidden the backup USB drive was lying open on the desk. Her stomach dropped. She frantically searched the room, but the drive was gone. A knock at the door startled her. Adrian entered, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "Thomas," he said, his voice a growl. "He's trying to intimidate you." Clara nodded, her fear turning to anger. "He's not just intimidating me, he's trying to destroy the evidence." Adrian stepped closer, his eyes fierce. "Do you have another copy?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice steady. "The original footage is with Dr. Harris." Adrian exhaled, relief washing over him. "Good. We still have the upper hand." Clara's jaw tightened. "He's crossed the line, Adrian. We need to act now." That night, Clara sat alone in the kitchen, her thoughts racing. The walls of Belmont Manor felt suffocating, every creak and shadow reminding her of the danger she faced. She had always been cautious, but Thomas's invasion of her room was a stark reminder of how high the stakes had become. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps. Clara froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the nearest object, a heavy rolling pin. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the kitchen door. "Clara," Thomas's voice called, smooth and mocking. "Are you still awake?" She didn't answer, her grip tightening on the rolling pin. The door creaked open and Thomas stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "You seem tense," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Is everything all right?" Clara forced herself to stay calm. "Just finishing up, sir." Thomas leaned against the counter, his smile sharp. "Good. You're a valuable part of this household, Clara. I'd hate to see anything happen to you." The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thomas." "Of course you are," he replied, pushing off the counter. Good night, Clara. As he left, Clara let out a shaky breath, her grip on the rolling pin relaxing. She knew now more than ever that she couldn't let her guard down. Thomas was playing a dangerous game, but so was she, and she had no intention of losing. The morning broke cold and gray over Belmont Manor, the thick clouds pressing down as if in anticipation of the storm about to erupt within its walls. Clara's hands shook slightly as she prepared Mrs. Lennox's tea, ensuring it was untampered before carrying it upstairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind racing with the weight of the day ahead. In Mrs. Lennox's room, Clara helped the frail woman sit up and placed the cup carefully in her hands. The matriarch smiled weakly. "You're always so attentive, Clara," she murmured, her voice thin but warm. Clara returned the smile, masking her growing anxiety. "It's my pleasure, ma'am." As she adjusted the pillows behind Mrs. Lennox, Clara's mind lingered on the plan. Dr. Harris had called that morning to confirm what they already suspected: the presence of a slow-acting toxin in Mrs. Lennox's system. The evidence was irrefutable, and the authorities had been notified. It was only a matter of time before they arrived. Adrian paced in the library, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. Clara stood near the window, watching the driveway for any sign of the police. She could feel Adrian's tension, his energy barely contained. "We should confront him now," Adrian said, his voice sharp with anger. "We can't wait." Clara turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "We need to let the authorities handle this. If we push too hard, he could retaliate." Adrian stopped pacing and faced her, his fists clenched. "He's my brother. I can't just stand by while he destroys what's left of this family." Clara softened, her tone gentler. "I know this is hard, but the best way to stop him is to let the evidence speak for itself. We've done everything we can." Adrian nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. I just hate feeling powerless." Before Clara could respond, the sound of a car pulling up the driveway caught their attention. She moved to the window, her breath catching as two police vehicles came into view. The confrontation unfolded with the raw intensity of a long-brewing storm. Thomas was in his study when the officers arrived, his initial confusion giving way to a cold, simmering anger as they presented the warrant. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "My mother's condition has nothing to do with me." "We have evidence that suggests otherwise," one of the officers replied, his tone neutral but firm. "Please cooperate, Mr. Lennox." Clara and Adrian stood in the doorway, watching as Thomas's composure began to crack. His gaze shifted to Clara, his eyes narrowing with venomous suspicion. "You," he hissed. "You've been meddling where you don't belong." Clara held her ground, her chin raised defiantly. "Your mother trusted me to look after her, Mr. Thomas. I've done nothing more than my duty." "You call this loyalty?" Thomas spat, his voice rising. "You're nothing but a servant. How dare you?" "Enough," Adrian interrupted, stepping forward. "Thomas, this is over. The truth is out, and you're going to answer for what you've done." Thomas's eyes flashed with fury, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Always the noble son, always so perfect." "This isn't about me," Adrian said, his voice steady but resolute. "It's about her." He gestured toward their mother's room. "You've hurt her in ways that can never be undone." Before Thomas could respond, the officer stepped in, placing him in handcuffs. He struggled briefly, his protests echoing through the hall, but the fight had left him. As he was escorted out of the manor, his gaze lingered on Clara, his expression a chilling mix of hatred and disdain. In the aftermath, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Clara returned to Mrs. Lennox's room, finding the matriarch sitting upright, her expression a mixture of confusion and relief. "Clara," she said softly, reaching for her hand. "What's happened?" Clara hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Everything's going to be all right, ma'am. You're safe now." Mrs. Lennox's grip tightened slightly, her gaze searching Clara's face. "You've always been like family to me, you know. More than my own children sometimes." Clara blinked back the sting of tears, her voice steady. "You've always been kind to me, ma'am. I only did what was right." Later that evening, Clara and Adrian sat together in the library, the weight of the day finally settling over them. Adrian stared into the empty fireplace, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our family is broken." Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. "It's not your fault, Adrian. What matters now is what you do moving forward." He looked at her, his expression filled with gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Clara. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Clara smiled faintly. You're stronger than you think, Adrian. Your mother will need you now more than ever. As the night deepened, the two sat in companionable silence, the storm outside the manor finally giving way to a fragile calm. The truth had been unveiled, but the road to healing was only beginning. The following days brought a whirlwind of change to Belmont Manor. The arrest of Thomas Lennox had sent shockwaves through the household and the wider community. News of his heinous actions spread quickly, tarnishing the once respected family name. Clara moved through the days with a quiet determination, tending to Mrs. Lennox while Adrian worked tirelessly to repair the damage. The family confronts the fallout. Adrian stood in the grand parlor, staring out the window at the sprawling gardens that seemed to mock the chaos within. The door creaked open and Mrs. Lennox entered, leaning heavily on her cane. Her steps were slow but deliberate, her frailty no longer an obstacle to her resolve. "Adrian," she called softly, her voice still tinged with the grace of her younger years. He turned, his face clouded with worry. "Mother, you should be resting." Mrs. Lennox shook her head. "I've rested enough. It's time we talked." Adrian guided her to a seat near the fireplace, kneeling beside her. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Thomas, everything he did?" "Your brother made his choices," Mrs. Lennox said firmly, though pain flickered in her eyes. "But you've made yours too, and they've been the right ones. You saved me, Adrian." He looked down, shame and guilt etched into his features. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have done something." "Don't," she interrupted, placing a trembling hand on his. "What matters is that you were here when I needed you most. That's more than enough." Clara's legacy of courage. Clara spent her days tending to the details of the household, her interactions with Mrs. Lennox filled with warmth and mutual respect. The bond between them had deepened in the wake of the turmoil, a quiet understanding passing between them that words couldn't capture. One afternoon, as Clara was folding linens in the laundry room, Adrian found her. His presence filled the small space, his expression serious but kind. "I wanted to talk to you," he began, leaning against the doorway. Clara glanced up, her hands pausing in their work. "Of course, Mr. Adrian." "Please," he said, his tone softer. "Call me Adrian. After everything, formality feels unnecessary." Clara nodded, offering a faint smile. "What's on your mind?" Adrian hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You've done more for this family than I can ever repay. You risked everything to protect my mother. If there's anything you need, anything at all, please tell me." Clara met his gaze, her voice steady. "I didn't do it for a reward, Adrian. I did it because it was the right thing to do." He nodded, a faint smile curving his lips. "That's exactly why you deserve one. The consequences for Thomas." The trial came swiftly. With the overwhelming evidence provided by Clara and Dr. Harris, Thomas had little room to deny his crimes. He sat in the courtroom, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a hollow resignation. The judge's voice rang out, sentencing him to a lengthy prison term for attempted murder and endangerment. Adrian and Mrs. Lennox were present, their faces stoic as the sentence was handed down. Clara stayed behind, not needing to witness the final fall of a man who had already lost everything. When Adrian returned to the manor that evening, he found Clara in the garden, tending to the roses Mrs. Lennox loved so much. For a moment, he simply watched her, the strength and humility she carried so effortlessly leaving him in quiet awe. A new leadership. Adrian took on the mantle of leadership with a determination to set things right. He began restructuring the family's business, implementing ethical practices that honored the values his mother had once upheld. He worked tirelessly but not without gratitude for the support of those who had stood by him. One evening, Adrian called Clara to the library. She arrived to find him seated at his father's old desk, a stack of papers before him. "Clara," he began, standing as she entered. "This house isn't the same without you. I don't want to assume, but would you consider staying? Not as a housekeeper but as someone I trust implicitly. This place needs someone like you." Clara blinked, surprised by his words. "You mean that?" "More than anything," Adrian said. "You've been the heart of this house, and I'd be honored if you chose to remain." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, warmth spreading through her chest. "I'll think about it," she said softly. As the days passed, the shadows of Thomas's betrayal began to lift. The once dark halls of Belmont Manor were filled with the promise of renewal, the scent of blooming flowers in the garden symbolizing the fresh start the family so desperately needed. Clara, though weary from the battles she had fought, found herself looking forward to what lay ahead. The storm had passed and now, with justice delivered, there was room for hope to grow. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Belmont Manor, casting warm golden light onto its polished floors. The house, once shrouded in shadows of deceit and tension, now hummed with a quiet sense of renewal. Clara stood at the foot of the sweeping staircase, watching as Mrs. Lennox descended with careful steps, her frailty softened by a new determination. "Good morning, ma'am," Clara greeted, her tone warm. Mrs. Lennox paused, resting a hand on the banister. "Good morning, Clara. I feel stronger today. Perhaps the house feels lighter now." Clara smiled. "It does?" The Lennox family rebuilds. Over the next few weeks, the family worked to rebuild what had been fractured. Adrian threw himself into managing the family estate with a fresh perspective, prioritizing integrity over ambition. Mrs. Lennox, though still recovering, took an active role in guiding her son, offering wisdom that had long gone unspoken in the shadow of her eldest child. The house itself seemed to awaken. Curtains were drawn open, sunlight streaming into rooms that had once felt cold and lifeless. The staff moved through their duties with a renewed energy, their quiet smiles reflecting the shift in the household's atmosphere. Clara's role, however, remained at the heart of the change. Though she continued her daily work, her presence was no longer that of a simple housekeeper. Mrs. Lennox often sought her out for quiet conversations, and Adrian relied on her as a confidant in moments of uncertainty. Clara finds her path. One afternoon, Clara sat on a bench in the garden, her gaze resting on the vibrant roses she had tended with care. Adrian approached, his steps crunching softly on the gravel path. He held a steaming cup of tea, which he offered her before taking a seat beside her. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," Adrian said, his tone light. Clara nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. "It's peaceful. The house has been so busy lately. It's nice to have a quiet moment." Adrian studied her, his expression thoughtful. "You've done more for this family than we could ever repay. But I have to ask, what do you want for yourself, Clara? You've given so much to others. It's time to think about you." The question caught her off guard. 4 years, Clara's life had been defined by her service to others, her own dreams and desires set aside. Now, as she considered Adrian's words, she felt a spark of something she hadn't dared to hope for in years: possibility. I don't know," Clara admitted. "I've never really thought about it." Adrian smiled gently. "Well, when you're ready, just know you'll always have a place here. But whatever you decide, I'll support you." Clara looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Adrian. That means a great deal." A final farewell to the past. The day Thomas was taken away felt like the closing of a chapter. Clara stood at the edge of the manor's long driveway, watching as the distant sound of car engines faded. Mrs. Lennox joined her, leaning lightly on her cane. "Thank you for staying, Clara," she said softly. "I know this house has been a difficult place, but I hope you'll find it can also be one of peace." Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "It already feels like a different place, ma'am." A new chapter begins. As Belmont Manor settled into its new rhythm, Clara began to explore the possibilities Adrian had spoken of. One evening, she sat at her small desk, a blank sheet of paper before her and a pen in her hand. Slowly, she began to write, pouring her thoughts onto the page. For the first time, her words were for herself, not dictated by duty or expectation. Adrian, walking past her room, paused in the doorway. "What are you working on?" he asked with a curious smile. Clara glanced up, a hint of embarrassment in her expression. "Just something I've been thinking about for a while." "Well, I'm sure it's brilliant," he said, his tone sincere. "Let me know if you'd like to share it." Clara nodded, her smile soft but genuine. "Maybe one day." The promise of tomorrow. Belmont Manor stood tall against the horizon, its shadows now softened by the golden light of a new beginning. The family that had once been broken now worked to rebuild, their bonds growing stronger with each passing day. And at the heart of it all was Clara, a woman whose quiet courage had changed their lives forever. As Clara walked through the garden that evening, the scent of roses filling the air, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The darkness had passed, and now, the promise of tomorrow stretched before her like an open road. What do you think of Clara's journey? Would you have made the same choices in her position, or would you have done something differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more inspiring tales. Your perspective means the world to us, so leave a comment and let us know how Clara's story made you feel. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.